Welcome to Vision Chats, where the only thing that matters is the future. I'm Farouk, Vice Provost at Johns Hopkins University, and I am thrilled to welcome you all to our conversation today. I decided to talk today about what's happening in higher education. Enrollment numbers seem to be dropping for the last couple of years, and I'd like to dig in and find out a little bit more about what the reasons are, and what we can do about them, or if there's anything to do about them. And there was a report that I just read recently that was done by Gallup and the Lumina Foundation that was titled "The State of Higher Education." I recommend that all of you go and find it online and read it. And when I read this report, I thought of one person specifically, and it was you, Brandon Busteed. Thank you for accepting my invitation. I could not think of another person to talk about all these numbers and all of the information that were showing up in that report. How have you been?
Doing well, living the Zoom dream like most, and slowly starting to reemerge into campus visits and in-person events. And so that's it's been nice, but a little scary. I've kind of lost my sea legs, so to speak, in terms of getting out and about. But in any event, I've been well, and it's good to connect with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure to have you. I saw your LinkedIn post about trying to learn how to fly again and how to travel again. That happened to me too. And what cracked me up is that I also lost my pre-check, like my privileges, or it expired, and I didn't even realize it. So now I have to renew. And probably the same thing that happened to you is that you realize that I don't know if you're having to do an appointment, but I'm having to do one because I'm upgrading to global travel, and it's like I have to wait 6 months to make that happen.
Yeah, no, that was a mess. I mean, I was like one of the first members of TSA Pre. I had global entry. Yeah. For whatever reason, they couldn't notify me that it expired. So I like the last three trips I was on, I didn't have TSA Pre. I was complaining. I'm like, what's wrong? Of course, it expired. So I literally just signed up today to re-register and made an appointment. But I mean, it's that kind of stuff that, I used to feel like I was a professional traveler. Now I'm like reduced to rookie status again after a 2-year hiatus. So,
yeah, it reminds me of what's the name of that movie with George Clooney?
Yeah, Up in the Air.
Up in the air. So I imagine you as the up in the air guy. Well, listen, Brenda, let me just make sure to introduce you properly for those who are not familiar with it. You are one of the prolific thought leaders in the higher education spaces. I and many others follow you on LinkedIn and Twitter, and we've heard your keynote talks. You serve currently as a chief partnership officer and global head of Learn, Work, Innovation at Kaplan. And for those of you who are not familiar with Kaplan, beyond the testing that they do and the assessments that they do, they're the premier provider of educational services for individuals, schools, and businesses worldwide. And Brandon, before you joined Kaplan, I've known you when you worked for Gallup prior to that, and you were then the senior partner and global head. And previous to that, you were executive director of workforce development at Gallup. And what I didn't know is that back in the day, you started a company. You were a founder and CEO of Outside the Classroom Inc. with Incorporated, which is very appropriate to this conversation. So this is awesome. So welcome again. And I invite all of you to go and follow Brandon on Twitter and LinkedIn and other social media platforms. So you worked at Gallup, and Gallup did this study with Lumina Foundation on the state of higher education. And let's start first with what's going on now. It sounds like we've dropped 1 million students, or enrollment in colleges in the United States dropped by almost 1 million in the last couple of years since the start of the pandemic, and by close to 3 million in the last decade alone. What is going on in higher education? I know you visit a lot of college campuses, and you must have seen some of these patterns and trends as you connect with universities.
I think the short answer is there's a lot going on. I think there's certainly a handful of really key drivers behind some of that, Farouk. And just to double click a little bit on the numbers you just shared, we hit, interestingly enough, what I call peak higher ed enrollment in the United States in the year 2011. That was the year which we had the highest number of students enrolled in degree-seeking programs in U.S. higher ed. Mm-hmm. And we've declined every year since. So we're heading into our 13th consecutive year of declining enrollments in U.S. higher education. And we've shed, since peak higher ed in 2011, we've shed 3.72 million students. So in real terms, right, we're close to 4 million fewer students than where we were in 2011. So those are real eye-opening numbers. The trend has been consistently down. And many folks have heard for a while about the coming population age demographic trough that we're entering into in terms of traditional 18-year-olds coming of age in the United States. This was, Nathan Graw's work that he broke in a book several years ago. So it's not new news, but it's now starting to hit campuses, and in certain regions, disproportionately so, right? So the Northeast, for example, is disproportionately getting hit by this in terms of having fewer and fewer 18-year-olds. And so the prediction on that is that between 2025 and 2030, we're going to continue to see the population of 18-year-olds declining. And then on top of that, you've got a declining percentage of those 18-year-olds enrolling in degree-seeking programs. So I've been on record saying that we might go 20 consecutive years of declining enrollments in U.S. higher ed. Now, I don't think that's predetermined, right? But that's what, the forecast and some of the data could show. So although we've already been on a decline, the simple point is most institutions are going to need to brace probably for more. But just to your question about the major things going on, we have a pricing issue. So the cost of higher education has just continued to skyrocket. And even though a lot of institutions are offering substantial discounts on their tuition, the sticker price is still an eye-opening number for most families, and most especially for those in the middle class, from underserved communities, for first-gen students, right, who aren't as aware of this fairly complex and opaque process of going to college, getting financial aid, understanding that the sticker price may not be the actual price you pay, and knowing that there's all kinds of versions of grants, financial aid, student loans. It's overwhelming. So price tag is a big one, because I'll put it relative to healthcare. We've all complained about the rising costs of healthcare. The cost of higher ed tuition has outpaced healthcare 2x over the last 25 years, right? So there's really no excuse for this. And so that's one of them. And then the other big kind of looming critique of higher ed that was around long before the pandemic and continues to be accelerated and exacerbated by the pandemic is the lack of belief in the work readiness of graduates from college, right? And so this is a rampant, vote of no confidence. If you survey the general population of Americans or C-level executives or even college and university trustees, they're all incredibly negative about the work readiness of college graduates. And so when you put those two things together, rising costs, doubts about one, critical aspect of the return on investment, and you create a vortex of real serious debates among Americans about the value of it. And I'll just say, one other thing in this, there are a growing number of very clear and attractive alternatives to college that are also starting to eat away at the college value proposition. Now, it's still true as of the latest economic data, you get a bachelor's degree, complete a bachelor's degree, right? You earn more over your lifetime than somebody who only has a high school diploma. But in certain majors from certain schools, that's actually not true in certain cases, right? So it's not a given, it's not an automatic. And so those are, I think, the two big issues is rising costs, our inability to stem the rising costs of higher ed, and then these doubts about the work readiness relative to what we're paying. Those are the big ones.
What are some of the alternatives to education?
Well, so there's a couple major trends that are happening. You're seeing more employers who are creating their own certificates or certifications, right? Google is one of the most prominent, the Google IT certs, but IBM, Amazon with AWS, Meta with some of their, certificates. there's so much demand for jobs for people who hold those types of skill sets. And a lot of those programs are 6 to 12 week type training programs that can immediately propel somebody into a very respectable wage job. In fact, competitive to college bachelor degree graduates in many of those cases. And then on top of it, you have an employer like Google that's not only creating these certificates, right, offering them in the marketplace and a big driver of the jobs available at the other end of them. They came out and they made a very profound statement and said, we are going to treat these certificates as equivalent to a college degree in our own hiring process, right? That has been, one of the kind of meteoric statements out there from a very well-recognized global employer. They're not alone. Several others have announced those things. I was just at a conference in LA, literally flew back yesterday, and I met a young gentleman who's running a nonprofit that's working with former convicts, right? Folks who are getting out of prison, formerly incarcerated, and working to get them truck driving licenses. And their salaries are starting anywhere between $65,000 and $100,000 a year. Well, that outdistances quite, but there's just so much demand for truck driving that you say, well, but Brandon, maybe they'd still be better off if they get a college degree. Sure, but why not have a $100,000 trucking job and do an online degree while you're getting paid $100,000, right? As opposed to, another route. Like, these are the kinds of things that are starting to happen. And I'll just add one quick one because it's a college included version of all this, but it's an alternative traditional college. More and more employers are offering, as part of their benefits package, the opportunity to get a college degree. So you could go work today for Walmart or Papa John's or any number of employers, get paid, and as part of your benefit of working there, get your college degree paid for literally down to the final penny. So now that doesn't mean I live on a residential campus, I'm working, I'm doing an online degree program, but if you want to get a college degree and you want to do it debt-free, that's a heck of an option for people who find that attractive.
Right. I'm looking at the report, and it absolutely aligns with what you're saying. Is the top reasons for college students to either delay enrollment in colleges or pick alternatives or just don't enroll at all are cost or finances. It is their belief or their confidence in the value of the degree that they will receive. And of course, you juxtapose that with cost, and that the math doesn't add up. But they're also they're also listing stress, family responsibilities, and then work conflict. And what we know in our business is that when the economy is really strong, when labor markets are strong and you have lots of options, then enrollment in college degrees, particularly in graduate degrees, drops, and vice versa. So when the economy is not going so well and the market doesn't produce a lot of jobs, then more people might choose to go to college. So right now, you're right that the people have a lot of alternatives, and I want to focus a little bit on this value of higher education, because it's playing center stage now in how colleges think of themselves and their own value. I don't know if this was Gallup. You would know this better than I. That it was Gallup that did that study back in the day when they interviewed provosts and presidents, but then also CEOs of companies, and about how well prepared college graduates are for the workplace, and the difference was really, really big.
Yeah. The only people who are confident they're doing a good job are college and university provosts. So, there's a big disconnect there in the definition of work readiness between provosts and the other populations that are served.
Exactly. So we're starting to see maybe some of the colleges and universities shift a little bit their narratives and say that we're going to invest more in career preparation and in vocational guidance, and even in just realigning academic programs with the needs of industry, although there is still a lot of resistance. What are you seeing there? And if you don't mind, maybe talk about the Career Corps program that you've started at Kaplan that addresses some of that.
Yeah, well, look, Farouk, I think, you're one of many leaders in higher ed that are a great example of how universities have really started to place career readiness and, personal development or life design, at the forefront
Yeah.
of their institution. Creating more senior level positions, right? Embedding it in the academic core of the mission as of the institution, as opposed to, have it sit out on its own, perhaps, in more of the, the kind of traditional student affairs placement of it as, the corner basement office that students may end up visiting potentially, sort of, kind of, right? And so I'm encouraged to see some really great examples out there where this has been made a newly important and strategic priority by institutions. I think it's also wise to be doing it because if you look at what parents and students are evaluating in coming to an institution, right? I mean, they're looking at a lot of factors, but they're starting to ask harder and harder questions about that return on investment. And it really is about job and career outcomes. And so what I've seen in the work I've been involved with Kaplan, a lot of the dialogue I've had at conferences and on LinkedIn, there has been a huge uptick in particularly liberal arts colleges and universities who are really starting to think very carefully about how they weave. So here's what every employer wants, right? They want a broadly educated graduate who also is specifically skilled. So it's a both and, it's not an either or.
Like,
so to be
this
clear,
is a T-shaped thing.
Yeah. I mean, do employers value a liberal arts grad? Yes, they do, but they don't necessarily use that terminology, right? Like that's a whole other side point I want to go down. But the term liberal arts just doesn't resonate. The power of the pedagogy that undergirds it, though, is really as relevant as ever before, right? So if you use terminology like critical thinking and skilled communication and cultural understanding, boom, that nails it. But if I say liberal arts, people are like, well, it just the name is actually part of the challenge. But here's the point. Employers do value the broadly educated, right, in the traditional liberal arts sense student, but they also want to see them with some sort of specific skill set aligned to the kinds of industry or job, right, where, and in addition to that, have had some demonstrated work experience, an internship, a co-op, right? There's a lot of derivatives of that. But those are the things they really want to see. And so, for example, they'll trade, this is an interesting point from research, they'll trade a whole letter grade in terms of grade performance for a student who has a work experience. In other words, employers would rather hire a B student with an internship than an A student who never had one. So it's not that they're saying grades don't matter. What they are saying is that work experience is really, really important, man, right? Like, so let's do this. And yet you step back and say, how many universities have embedded a learn work experience in their curriculum? Like there's examples, but at scale, we come to a handful of places. The traditional co-op institutions like Northeastern or Drexel. We've got innovative work happening at elites like a Hopkins or a Wake Forest, right? Based on some of the things that have been happening there. But anyway, the point is I've seen a lot of action among liberal arts colleges and universities to ramp up what they're doing in career services, to start to think about things like providing academic credit for internships, to embed either micro credentials or industry recognized credentials into the experience for students. So now I leave with, I have a major in English and I got a designation in cybersecurity, right? There's no reason why we can't do the both and, as opposed to thinking about them as totally distinct aspects of somebody's preparation.
Is that what the Career Corp is supposed to do?
So we launched a year ago, so this is still fairly new, a shared services offering for colleges and universities, and started it in partnership with Andy Chan and the team at Wake Forest. And there's really two major components to it, Farouk. One, we've built world-class online career and personal development courses, right? Academically rigorous ones that if your faculty were to look at it, they would say, wow, that's a really well done course, right? There's some real academic heft and rigor to it. A lot of college universities are starting to nibble on developing academic courses around career and personal development, but they have a tough time bringing it to scale. They have a tough time doing it at a really high degree of quality. But then the other major component of Career Corps is that we've built a whole team of industry and role specific advisors that students can access. So in any individual college or university, it's impractical and unaffordable to build a team of 40 or 50 advisors. in each, of the major industry or role domains that students are getting hired into. So like take data science, for example. It's been the hottest job in America, I think, for 3 years running. Some people know what it is. Others are like, hey, I've just heard data science. Like, what's that? Here's the point. We have an advisor who is an industry expert on data science. And they run live sessions that are like intro to data science. What is this? I don't know much about it. To, the other end of students who are like, I want to go into data science. How can I get really well prepared for interviews, for a job in that space? What other types of supplemental education might I need to know, like learning Python, right? Or whatever it might be. And so, the universities that are working with us, they still have their advising team that's part of their campus team, right? Those are the folks that have served as really powerful kind of generalist foundational advisors. But if a student comes in and says, I'm interested in data science, or I'm interested in cybersecurity, or whatever the major category might be, you may not have people who have deep expertise in that. That's where they can access live advisors through Career Corps. So we've tried to not reinvent a wheel that was already in existence, but think about how to augment and scale at a quality level some of the things that we know students were most interested in accessing. And those were the two major components that we heard from all of the market research and the lead into thinking about it. So we're excited. Just yesterday, Fast Company recognized it as one of the world-changing ideas. So it was neat to see that we're at least on a pretty good track so far.
Congratulations on that. Yeah, that's a great distinction, and what a service. And and the more universities can partner with one another to solve these problems, the better. I wonder, hearing you talk about these things, if there's a case here for higher education to think seriously about competency-based education as a model, and for the benefit of our audience is doing so is really not measuring progress in education by time or by number of credits anymore, but rather is by competencies that are learned. So for some students might learn those competencies in 6 months, others might take them a year or a year and a half. And I know that universities that focus on adult learners and online universities are big fans of that approach. Is there a case here for us as a higher education industry to think seriously about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a super important point, Farouk, right? The largest university in the United States now, fastest growing, is Western Governors University.
Yeah.
And I literally just had breakfast on Tuesday morning with Scott Pulsifer, the president of WGU. He's been there now about 5 years. They're celebrating their 25th anniversary. Interestingly enough, he came from Amazon, which is one of the most customer-centric organizations in the world. And he has very much brought a student-centric orientation to everything that they do at WGU. Here's the interesting thing. They are going to graduate, not enroll. They're going to graduate 50,000 students this year alone. Right? Just to give you an idea of the scale of WGU. WGU is an entirely online, catered to adult learner, but they're having a growing number of traditional age students as enrollments, which is an interesting thing to take note of. And they're a competency-based model. And where we sit today, there's still generally not a lot of awareness and understanding about what a competency-based educational model is, but it ought to be something that most of us endorse, because what it says very simply is, hey, Farouk, if you can show me mastery of a particular course or subject, you move on. And so time is now not the determining factor, right? Like 4 years, we just kind of magically say 4 years is the number. Like if you have a student who has already mastered a subject and can test out of it or show competency in that area, they accelerate forward. And what's interesting is their average time to bachelor degree completion is under 2.5 years.
Wow.
So now this isn't for everybody. I mean, like, let's just take a step back. The parents and students who really desperately value that on-campus residential experience, right? And the social maturation and other things that come with it. You may not want to accelerate it, right? But that's becoming more of a luxury. I'm going to put that out there. I think that's becoming more of a luxury for most people because it's more costly. It takes more time and more money, right? But for those who want to accelerate their time to a job, right? Accelerate while they're working, their completion of a bachelor's degree, who say, I can live without, those residential aspects of the college experience. it becomes a pretty powerful thing. It works well for military veterans who are coming out of the military. They've already been trained on a lot of things, right? Like, why aren't we awarding credit from their prior learning? So that's another concept that I think is still, misunderstood in higher ed, right? Like, if you can show me that somebody's completed a curriculum before that's very similar to the one I offer, why do I make them take it again, right? Because like my intro to psych course is so much different and better than that intro to psych course, whatever the example might be. So I do think there are lessons to learn from the fastest growing area of higher ed. This is a great stat. You look at growth in higher ed last year, it was basically flat. But if you took out WGU, Southern New Hampshire University, University of Maryland Global College, it would have been down 3%. Right. Yeah. So a handful of institutions are actually moving the needle on our national enrollments. That's how fast they're growing. And I think it would behoove all of us to think about, are there elements of that are more student centric, right? Because that's really the story here. Put online aside for a second, right? Student centric. If I can show you I know it and master it, why can't I move on, right? Like that's frustrating to somebody, right? Like, I'm going to repeat a course that I already know. Like, that's boredom. That's a waste of money. I would argue that's even a waste of the faculty time teaching somebody who's already learned something. Like, we don't want to waste that precious energy.
I love everything you said. And I think what's interesting is that we're seeing that audience, or that population of students broadened a little bit, so more younger people are choosing those pathways to college than the traditional residential experience. I think that's really interesting that's happening now.
Yeah, what would be your take? I mean, I'm curious how you think Hopkins students would think about, competency-based model, right? Like, and I'm asking about, the traditional residential, 4-year Hopkins student. I mean, this is an elite university. Like, do you think a concept like competency-based learning woven into some of it would be, is there going to be receptivity to that?
I don't think so. No, I don't think as it is, and fully packaged as competency based. I think there are elements of it that are finding their way in there. So, for example, the concept of experiential learning, immersive experiences, some of the courses that are being introduced that are much more skill based. Certainly would be are being woven into the curriculum at these types of schools. But as a packaged program like that, I don't see it. But also, I don't think that these are the institutions that are truly feeling the pain of drops in enrollment. You really see the major transformation in how and how the academic experience is delivered in the schools and colleges that are really feeling the pain. So I think we might see them in the small liberal arts colleges, but before we see them elsewhere, possibly the regional publics. So that's one. Two, I know that the universities that have that focus on online education and online learning and adult learning typically get some of their enrollment from students who have interrupted their education prior. So I've gone to college and dropped out after 1 or 2 years because life got in the way, work, family, health issues, etc. And given that we've had a rise in that pattern in the last couple of years, especially in the pandemic, I think, well, at least I'm predicting that those universities will see even more in the next couple of years of those students who have interrupted their education in the last 3 years. I mean, the fact that we've lost 1 million or we've seen the enrollment drop by 1 million in the last 3 years, that's going to re-enter the education pathways again sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. And most likely they will choose pathways that are much more in line with readiness for work, quicker, which means cheaper, and focused on competencies and skills that matter to employers. So to circle back to the question that you asked also is that some of our universities, including where I work and where I've worked before, are there's still tradition in the value of an academic experience. And then there's still sort of like the friction between that and the vocational value that is very much part of the conversation that I think it would not be so easy for competency-based education to be fully implemented in these types of universities. Really good question. Hey, we got a question here about lower enrollments versus high number of college applications, and how do we reconcile that? Let me just throw just an idea at you and then see if you have any reactions and if you had additional thoughts, because I'm not sure if I really fully have full evidence about college applications being that high. But what I'm thinking is happening is that with a common app and how easy it is, or how much easier it is to apply for colleges now, coming out of high school, that students are applying for a lot more colleges than they have in the past. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it's more students applying. Is that it's on average the number of applications per student has gone up. Is that what you're seeing too, or what do you think is happening here?
Yeah, I think that's largely the case, right? There's a difference between how many unique applicants are there and how many applications were submitted. And then, of course, there's a big difference between applications submitted to the top tier institutions, right? Which, every year seems to be more and more and more. I mean, every board meeting that I've ever been to at an elite college or university, they prominently brag about how applications are up again, and the acceptance rate is down, and like we play that game in the elite category. Outside the elite category of higher ed, right? Like there's really no evidence that there's been institutions getting a deluge of applications. And then, to your point, right? The ease of making multiple applications to multiple institutions certainly, aids that. I mean, look, I haven't been gone from college that long, but, roughly 25 years. I applied to 3 institutions, right? Like if I said that to a go-getter student today, they'd be like, what? 3, not 30, or 3, not 13, right? So there's been a major change in that. And and then again, right, like the real number of 18-year-olds going into that traditional age, demographic is, it's going to be on a pretty precipitous slide. About 15% is what the overall national numbers are. Again, some regions differently, but yeah, I think what you have there is there's still a frenzy. Probably will continue to be a frenzy around the highest ranked institutions and the very precious seats that are available at them. But that's really among what I would call your upper class student marketplace, right? These are the students whose both parents went to college, have multiple degrees, right? Like, they're planning for this. They've been saving for this. It's an important thing for them to talk to their friends about where their son or daughter goes. There's still a frenzy in that part of the higher ed market. But look, the beauty of U.S. higher education is it's an incredibly diverse system, right? We've got community colleges. We've got, major state flagship, public universities. We've got our public land grant system. We've got private colleges and universities. I mean, we have all different shapes and sizes of institutions. Some are doing better than others right now. But, the good news is we have a lot of variety out there. And we can start to see where some are being more successful than others. And like right now, I mean, I've made this point, the Western governors universities of the world, they're not alone. They're the most successful institutions in America today. I don't care what other measurement you put against it. They're the most successful because they're attracting the most students in terms of enrollment. So it's just, part of our conversation gets very differentiated. To your point, if we're talking about elite top 20, there is no enrollment issue, right? Like, you'd fill every seat at Hopkins if you opened up 100,000 in your freshman class. That's not the problem, right? Like, it's that we have to be very nuanced at some point in this conversation because it's disproportionately, like, for example, the enrollment drops were biggest in community colleges the past year. That's where we got hit the most.
And why is you would think that in this time we would see an increase in community college enrollment, given everything that we've just talked about, cost and value of higher education. And you would think that this is almost the most direct path to that. Why is it dropping? So, and it is the highest. I think was it 14%? I think I read just this last year.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's a lot there, and I don't, profess to have the highly detailed answer on that. But there's a couple big things going on. There are alternative non-degree paths to good jobs out there. The Google IT search, certain things like that, right? We also know that students and families in underserved communities, right, who have been in frontline jobs and having to, stand the stress of everything that's gone on during a pandemic, access to, Wi-Fi in their household, multiple devices, which they don't have. I sit here in a house where, there's 5 computers in this house and I have Wi-Fi. So at one time, all of us were at school and work here. There's a lot of households where there's one device if you're lucky, and there's no Wi-Fi, right? So anyway, I think we're looking at a population that was disproportionately hit and hurt by the pandemic. I also think that it's getting eaten away by some of the alternatives that are out there, but no one's really carefully defined that. I'll tell you another trend in these demographics that no one's talking about is the precipitous decline in male enrollments in U.S. higher education.
Yes. Yes.
The differential this year was the highest ever, 15% more women enrolling in higher ed than men. And that all has changed in a very short period of time. 25 years ago, far more men in higher ed. Now, a quarter century later, it's about 60% female. The question is, where are all the boys? Where are the men going, right?
And why?
That's a whole other thing.
Do we know why? Do we have any idea of what's happening?
We need to learn more. So some of you will remember I think about a year ago, the Wall Street Journal, Doug Belkin was the author, wrote an article about the declining number of men in college. And, he did a very thoughtful piece on it. And I actually followed up with him. I was like, I'm just curious what you've heard, from people since you wrote that article, because it was like, hey, here's some theories of what's going on. But we, to be honest, we don't really know. And so that's the kind of, deep research and understanding that's going to come from both quantitative and qualitative methods, I believe, right? There's some real digging we need to do to understand that, because I'll tell you why I'm really worried about it. This goes back to some of the Gallup, my Gallup days. If you looked at indicators globally of unrest at a country level, like if you were trying to monitor, hey, how are things going in, name your country, right? Mm-hmm. And Gallup at a global level is measuring things like well-being, how people rate and evaluate their lives. Well, there are indeed some indicators that would tell you that, hey, this is a country that could be going in the wrong direction. It wasn't necessarily GDP. There were instances where countries' GDP was going up steadily, but there was other stuff going on. But I tell you, one of the indicators, and Jim Clifton, the CEO of Gallup, was very provocative in saying this in many speeches and articles. He said, show me a country where there's a high percentage of unemployed young men, and I will show you a disaster ready to take place.
Yeah.
And so, the answer is we don't know. We need to dig into it, but it's also sort of not the kind of popular issue that has a rallying cry, because the story is, honestly, it's white men who are not enrolling in college at the rate that they used to before, right? And so you go, well, is that really a problem? I don't know, right? But the idea here is that's a decided change in the demographics in higher education. Is it a problem? If it is, what's going on, right? And how do we, think about, intervening in that, right?
There's a lot there, Brandon. This is such an important topic. This is purely anecdotal, but in my travels in the last few years, what I've seen is that gender gap in enrollment is also true in a lot of the countries that I have visited, actually in practically all of them. And I noticed that. And at the time when I noticed it, I thought it was unique to those countries, not in the United States, until I came back and, started digging into the numbers, and I found, oh, we're headed there too. But I found it, all over North Africa, Middle East, parts of Europe, Asia. So I wonder if it's more of a global phenomenon rather than just a U.S. Phenomenon. It'd be really interesting to look into that. Second, I wonder if what you said earlier is part of the reason is that there are alternatives. There is work. There are ways to and then that's what potentially males are choosing, and it depends on the disciplines that people are choosing. I mean, we're starting to see some higher numbers in STEM enrollment among women, but there's still a huge gap. I do studies in my work about salary gaps, and women are still paid far less than men for same positions right after graduation. So even with that, I think we're still seeing, even though more women are going to college, they're not necessarily better off, and men for potentially are seeing other alternatives that are just as fruitful, maybe even more. And I just wonder if things would change if the labor market tightens up, if the economy slows down to a point where, as we said earlier, there are less opportunities, so more people will look into higher education instead. The final point I want to throw in here is I'm looking at numbers, and those drops are also true for Black students, Latinx students, and Native American students. So we're seeing not only economically, but also for underrepresented minorities that they are hit actually with really high numbers. Then 3 years, and for Black students, 30% drop. So that's pretty concerning there. There are clearly shifts, and there are things that need to happen in order to address all of that. And I think what's scary is what you said earlier, is that potentially there's a disaster that's in the making that we're not paying attention to, because the impact of all of this, we're not going to feel it overnight. This might be 10 years down the road that we'll realize that we have an entire population that potentially did not take the pathways that could be beneficial to them. Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, look, you're right. I mean, if we were wise, we would all think about talent development pipelines in like 20-year segments, right? 10 and 20-year segments. There's no example of that anywhere in what we're doing. Like, employers don't think about that. So for example, I have not met a Fortune 500 CEO or chief human resources officer who isn't working hard to improve the number of underserved and minority employees in their ranks, right? Like, it has become, I don't know anybody I've met in that category that doesn't want to do that. And they're doing a lot of well-intentioned initiatives to try and improve that. But if they think they're going to solve that with a 10-week or 1-year initiative, like, go to STEM, right? So one of the studies I was involved in, some people have heard this expression: if you can't see it, you can't be it. And that's true. And it shows up as early as middle school. So if a young girl in 6th grade is told by her dad that, like, oh, that kind of job isn't for girls, whatever that job is, or somebody else says that to her, that's the first point at which she goes off the trajectory of thinking about that job, right? So we have fewer female teachers in STEM. Okay, there you go. Start with that problem, right? You want to improve the number of women in STEM. You got to start with girls at middle school who get inspired by, in some cases, female teachers in STEM. And so to change this trajectory, we need a 20-year investment, right? We would need a Fortune 500 company to say, okay, I tell you what, this isn't about trying to find new applicants today. That's part of it, right? Like, are we really getting a broad applicant pool? Sure, that's a great effort. It's also about, how can I invest in middle school STEM, right? In the form of, teachers who are, teachers that look like students in these Title I school districts where they're, traditionally underserved, right? So but that's the crazy point, right? By middle school, they start to go off that track or on that track, right? If we want to think about it as a glass half full.
Really powerful. This is really, really good stuff, Brendan. I want to shift a little bit to the conversation about stress, and it's been reported in this report that about a third of students who left college or who chose not to enroll did so because of stress. And we've seen the increase in mental health issues and the increase in investment among colleges, but not enough to address mental health. Certainly, the last 2 years haven't made it easier with COVID-19. And that all of that is playing into the decision of families and of students about whether or not to go to college now or ever, or choose another alternative. What are you seeing there?
Well, that was clearly one of the big findings from the recent Gallup Lumina Foundation study you noted, which is, stress being top of the list for why students are dropping out or not enrolling. And this is not unique to higher ed. I mean, I think this is the challenge of our day. And I think it's going to be a challenge for decades to come, right? I don't think there's just this blip, if you will, from post-pandemic, mental health challenges. Like we're in a whole new era. And in my opinion, it's going to become one of those issues where everybody has to play a role. What do I mean by everybody? There is no model where just hiring more mental health counselors at a university is ever going to meet the demand. It's just not sustainable. It just doesn't work.
Correct.
Sure, we probably need more of those professional resources, right? But what it means is, and I know this is going to scare a lot of people, it means you're a staff person, right? You need to be trained on how to be aware of different warning signs, right? People who are struggling with different mental health challenges, right? What you can do just as a simple friend or colleague to be supportive or encouraging or to intervene or to know when to suggest help or whatever it might be. I mean, I think for managers in the workplace, this is going to become one of the single most important challenges that they're going to have to be attuned to is, how do I take into account the whole person, right? We think about school as thinking about how I evaluate the academic person. We think about work as how do I evaluate somebody on the job. We can't move forward without looking at the whole person. We just, in any kind of organizational setting. So if I could look at your GPA and you might be crushing it there at Hopkins, Farouk, but there's a whole other side of you where you've got sick family member, you're dealing with depression, right? Like there's all kinds of those other dimensions that we have to be attuned to. Not many of us are comfortable with that. Not many of us have been trained to do that. So I'm not going to become a mental health expert, right, in terms of being a professional counselor, but as a manager, as a leader, as a family member, as a fellow student, right, as a faculty member, I need to have a much better understanding of this. And so we need to create an entire web of support around this. We need to bring it into the conversation set where we move from an expression I love. We move away from safe spaces toward brave spaces. Mm. Somebody was advising this in the context of DE&I initiatives, and I love that framing. I think the same thing applies for mental health, is we need to move from safe spaces, e.g. not talking about it or only thinking the path is just somebody quietly going to the counseling and psychological services office and hoping no one sees them walk in the door. Like we need to be able to talk about these struggles that we have and be able to be a little bit more human with one another in terms of how we support each other.
Yeah, this resembles also another way to think about it is rather than thinking about it from a perspective of treatment, is really thinking about it from a perspective of skills, coping skills. There's a lot to unpack there, and there are all sorts of reasons for why mental health is playing such a big role now. And certainly, I don't mean to reduce it to just one simple factor, which is that maybe this generation has more difficulty to cope with stress. There are other elements at play too. But I agree with one thing you said, which is that it's not like no institution can provide enough transactional services through multiple counselors to meet the demand that will only continue. And I've always said that the answer in an education setting is integration, not peripheral services. And if we're able to integrate, by the way, not just mental health, approaches or interventions, but also academic advising, and also, career success, and all of the elements that help a student, a whole student, as you said, be successful, integrate that into the curriculum and into the experience, that I think it would be doable to do it at scale. So the challenge for universities is indeed scale. And so I think that that's really difficult. Here's a thought that I've had also as I looked into this study. What about the impact of generations? So the students who have been going to college in the last 10 years are children of the boomers, I think, right? So they're millennials and they're children of boomers, and their expectations, or the boomers' expectations of their kids, in terms of going to college or not, and what to do in college, and how to experience that, and funding, and all of that, would be different from the next generation that's about to go to college, that's Gen Z, who I think would be the children of Generation X. I'm going to assume you're Generation X too, like me, right?
Just turned 45, so I don't know. I'm on the edge. I'm on the edge of generation.
You are. So the two of us are about the same age. So I think I'll just call us both Gen X. And I feel, I'm just going to speak as a sample of one here, is that my attitude towards the colleges that my kids would go to, if they go at all, are really different from people who are older than me, who think about their kids and what colleges are go to. Like, I'm not really thinking, and perhaps you have similar thoughts, I'm not really thinking about brand. I'm not really thinking, I'm really thinking about a completely different type of experience. And I would totally be open to one of my kids going to Western Governors or to an SNHU, or we're even thinking in our family, like the gap year before you go to college and go do something good for humanity would be something that should be done.
Right.
Is that a play here with enrollment, maybe? And anecdotally, and I'm only sharing some anecdotes, but I'm wondering if that's playing a role at all.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of creative options that most institutions can consider. We've talked a lot about the doom and gloom, right? Like, where do I see excitement, opportunity, hope for U.S. higher ed? I'll answer your question, but I kind of want to frame it up this way, right? We know it's booming for the WGUs of the world. So let's just call that online, and in that case, competency-based, but they have been very relentless about how to serve an adult learner. And interestingly enough, some of the features in doing that are now attractive to traditional age students. Convenience, flexibility. I can live at home, save some money, work while I'm doing this, right? Like, oh, by the way, I can travel and go to a different country while I'm doing my, degree, right? So you can combine the gap year with beginning your first year online, right? So, there's just so many. So if we just get a little creative, I was just at a conference where the chancellor of UCLA talked about how they're basically trying to eliminate summer and encourage, create a full academic, not just summer classes, but a full academic term, and just do school year round, right? And there's a lot of challenges in that, like getting faculty to teach in the summer who are used to, taking the time off or doing something else, right? So, not easy, but again, a simple example, like, why are we still building educational systems around an agrarian calendar when a tiny sliver of Americans are farmers now, where 150 years ago, a lot of them were, right? Like, we have to step out of some of that stupidity, because that's really all it is anymore. And so examples, right? Sure, I may still value the traditional residential experience, but I still want the flexibility to be able to take classes online. Why? Because, hey, I might want to travel this month and I can still keep my classes going and just do them remotely or whatever, right? Or I could do my whole first year online and then come to campus. Or, I can accelerate by doing classes online all the way through the summer while I'm back at home. There's so much creativity we can bring to this. And of course, the big thing that I want to come back to from your question is back to the work readiness point. Today's 18 to 25-year-olds are the least working generation in U.S. history. That is, their reports of working in a paid job, it's at the lowest in the history of measurement in the United States, which is about 70 years that we have this data. So, I mean, I'll step back and ask a simple question. Why would we think students are work ready if they're the least working generation in US history, right? And this, where am I going with this? Parents should seriously value the learning value of work more than I think they're doing now. I got a lot of parents, well-intentioned, that are like, they say to their son or daughter, hey, your job is to get good grades. Very well-intentioned. But what they're also doing is like, no, I don't want you to work. Like, if we can afford not to have you work, I just want you to focus on your academics, right? Well, okay, great, until you realize that that person now missed the experience of work and the learning value of that, right? So I think if we start to look at work as having inherent learning value, and we start to look at schools and universities as institutions that can create work integrated learning opportunities, I think we can solve all of this. It's just we haven't really pushed ourselves to think in those ways, and that's what I think all of us can hold ourselves accountable to.
I wish actually that colleges would integrate work as part of the academic experience, as I don't know, get credit for it or whatever. So I mean, and I'm not only thinking of the co-op experience, which I know a lot of schools do, or integrated internship, but just work on campus, work whether it's work study or just work to make money. I love the Endicott College and example, where by the time you graduate, you have to have 3 work experiences, and one of them can be working on campus, and another can be an internship, and so on and so forth. So I could not agree with you more. If you had a magic wand, what would you do? I know there is no silver bullet, but you have a magic wand. So how would you run your university in order to truly meet the demands of today for both students and the economy and the world?
Yeah. Well, certainly if I'm not already doing it, I'd be thinking about what non-degree educational offerings can I offer, right? If I think only about degree-based education, not a growth market, but if I start to think about my institution as an education institution, right, I start to open up thinking to all kinds of valuable non-degree paths. So that'd be one, right? The other on this work readiness point is that I think we need to get to a place where we have systems level approaches to it, right? It can't be optional or potential for a handful of students. So to your point, right, I would require an internship or a co-op as part of graduation. I would offer some learning credit for that. So it's embedded into the academic core of the institution, right? And so I would make sure that it was not an accident that a student had an internship or a co-op, that it was basically fundamental to the experience. And then along with that, right, like, again, this is my point about non-degree education, and this is work that I've been doing a lot of at Kaplan with different colleges, liberal arts institutions who want to add industry recognized credentials to a student's bachelor's degree, right? All kinds of examples of that, financial services, cybersecurity, right? Like, and so the idea of a degree and an industry credential, I mean, think of how that graduate stands out in the marketplace, right? It's like, that's exactly what an employer wants to see, the broadly educated student who's also specifically skilled. And so those are things that I would just find a way to make fundamental to the experience, right? It changes our incentive structures. It does a lot of things, but it has to be something that is fundamental, not optional. And that would be the area that I would really seriously look at.
I think that that is the transformation necessary in the residential college experience. That if, especially as enrollments continue to drop, and those pressures. I mean, I think especially the small liberal arts colleges, medium-sized public universities or state schools. These are the transformations that they can do. I'll tell you why. So the elites and highly selective it would be hard for them to do this, because that's what I hear all the time, and that's the argument of rigor. Is that it's really hard to really prove rigor in these types of experiences. Even though I know that you and I think that there's nothing more rigorous than a job where you have to work hard and you have to show up and deliver reports, etc. But there are questions among the academy about that. Anyways, there are lots of transformations ahead. I want to ask you one final question before we wrap up. How did you get into this type of work. How did your life evolve to eventually become a thought leader about these types of issues and working for Kaplan, and who knows where you'll be in the future?
I mean, look, a simple answer is I don't know. I think a lot of us, when we reflect on careers, right, it wasn't a linear path. There wasn't like I mean, there's probably a few of us that had a perfect formula when they were, 17 and executed that. But, I was a public policy major. So broadly, right, education as a topic is an area that I was always deeply interested in. I would have never predicted that I would have spent a career in education and workforce development, and I now have. But look, I'll tell you, I think the simple answer is incredible mentors who were all teachers and faculty members and coaches working in academic institutions, right? Like my whole life has been shaped by parents who valued education, saved money, made sure I went, right? By amazing teachers and faculty members who were life-changing in terms of their mentorship of me. And, if you just go back to that, expression you used earlier, kind of a pay it forward mentality, I don't know where else I'd want to be, right? But I've always thought about our educational system as just the beginning of how we think about human development. And I also think about the workplace as an important area that contributes to human development. So to me, the ultimate vision here is that 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we all look at a university or an employer, and we have a hard time telling whether it's an employer or a university.
Yeah.
That's the vision of the future, because there's going to be so much learning happening in the workplace. And there's going to be, I hope, a lot of work integrated aspects at the collegiate level that when you look at those two entities 10 or 20 years from now, you go, wait, is that an employer? Is that a university? I don't know.
Love that. And I think I'm going to use it, and I will credit you for it. I will cite you. But I love it. That's a great idea. This was fascinating. Thank you so much. Learned a lot from you today. Keep shaking things up and making waves out there and inspiring everyone. And I want to thank our entire audience for showing up today. Really appreciate it, Brendan. Really learned a lot from this conversation.
Well, it was fun, and thank you for your leadership too, Farouk. Enjoy watching what you're doing. You're a big part of creating the future for higher ed. So it's great to have time with you.
I appreciate it. It's very kind of you. Well, with that, I want to say goodbye to all of you. And as I always say, the only vision that matters is the one that you create. Go on and have a great day. Take care.
Take care. Thanks.